Winston Churchill once said, "There is no such thing as a good tax." Now, members of this House, that is certainly true in this case. Because although the EDB and large businesses in Singapore are fully for environmental protection, we believe that tax is not the way to go. Instead, we support the policy of direct environmental legislation, which has been implemented in Singapore since 1999. Now, it is this policy that best balances the policy objectives of building a sustainable environment with economic growth. It is also this policy that is implemented through the Environmental Protection Management Act, which is under the jurisdiction of the Director General of Environmental Protection, Mr. Joseph Hui. No, thank you, Madam. It provides for the direct control of pollution at the source by ensuring that measures such as making pollution control equipment compulsory, such as toxic gas absorbing filters and so on, are installed and put in place. Secondly, under Section 6 of the Act, all industrial companies need to comply with the Act's terms in order to get a license to operate. Now, at the same time, flexibility is also present because the exact terms of the Act are left to the discretion of the Director General. So, members of this House, this policy is more flexible and more direct than a tax policy. No, thank you, sir. And the Ministry of Finance needs to prove to us how the Act is not sufficient. And they have to prove how their policy is better than the Act on these two fronts. If they can't, then members of this House, the motion before us collapses. As the opposition, I'll be explaining how the Act surpasses tax on the grounds of directness, while my second speaker will illustrate the point of flexibility. But first of all, let's take a look at the policy put forth by the Ministry of Finance. Now, they left a lot of questions unanswered, such as, how did they decide at the optimum tax level? How did they come about it? How is this policy going to be enforced? Are all industries, no thank you madam, are all industries going to be affected, such as the manufacturing industry, which contributes 23% to our GDP, but will suffer if taxed? So clearly, we cannot be so foolhardy as to support this kind of unconsidered policy, because it might have severe ramifications on our country. I challenge the next speaker to come up and clarify these points of their policy. No, thank you, sir. Now, the arguments that the proposition has brought forth are also problematic. And why so? Because number one, tax is ineffective. It doesn't solve the problems it sets out to solve. Because they hope that miraculously, by implementing tax, hold on a minute, ma'am, by implementing tax, behavior will suddenly change and lead to environmental protection. But this is not true. Yes, ma'am.
Madam, the ERP has worked to prevent congestion. That means taxes work.
Yes, madam, but that is different because that is a tax on the amount of cars on the road. And just because the amount of cars on the road have reduced does not mean that tax is effective, because they may only have reduced it by a small percent, whereas legislation puts in place a framework that makes all companies accountable for environmental protection. Let me give you the example, no thank you sir, of the UK, where an environmental tax was implemented in 2001. 52%, ladies and gentlemen, of their companies have not implemented any kind of environmentally friendly practices. Clearly, tax is ineffective. Secondly, tax brings about negative economic consequences. And why? Because the EDB banks on our friendly and low tax regime as the main factor to attract investors. And the KPMG did a study across 12 economies which shows that there is a direct link between tax and foreign investment. If we tax the company now, the cost of business is going to go up.
Madam.
And your investment, thank you madam, is going to go down. The consequences here are going to be magnified in Singapore because Singapore depends on foreign investment for growth. No, thank you sir. So this is going to have dire consequences on our economy, on our employment, on our growth and our prosperity as a country. Now, in comparison, environmental legislation stands in a much better place, in a more effective position to help the environment directly. Now, how so? It makes sure that it's compulsory for all companies to comply with the terms of the Act before they get a license to operate. These terms include those mentioned under Sections 10 to 12 of the Act, such as the prohibition of the emission of nitrogen dioxide beyond the standard set. Now, when implemented, this directly impacts the environment because through the Yearbook of Statistics 2008, it showed that the nitrogen dioxide levels fell by 50% after the laws were implemented. Not only that, but legislation has been in place for over 10 years, and throughout these 10 years, our economic performance has been great. So clearly, legislation does not undermine the attractiveness of our country to investors as tax does. Now, at the end of the day, let us all stay the course on direct environmental legislation. Because if we move away from taxes, we move towards a greater environment. Thank you.